Darren Swanson, originally from Scotland, is an associate lecturer at the School of Access Education at CQ University's Sydney campus. Previously, he lived in the Kansai and Kobe region for some 8 years before decamping to Sydney. He joins us tonight thanks to a recommendation from Alex Byrne. And so from Sydney, Australia, please welcome Dr. Darren Swanson. Take it away.
Thank you. And thank you for the lovely welcome in Gaelic there as well, Charles. Unfortunately, I'm not a Gaelic speaker, but I can read a little bit. Okay, so thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Patricia, and I'm very honoured and looking forward to speaking with you all this evening about a subject that is kind of close to my heart because I don't often get a chance to speak about this, and really the subject of my talk tonight is really the reason why I guess I became interested in the Meiji period. Really, I had always been interested in Japan. I'm sure, like many of you, you've got your own interests in Asia or Japan in particular. But I had initially just been interested in Japan. I hadn't really known there was any Scottish connection at all, really. And then I had a conversation with an uncle of mine who had told me that in the early 1900s that the Japanese had ordered ships from my hometown in Aberdeen. So I just found this fascinating that Japan, a country that I really knew very little about in my late teens, had anything to do with my city, and had used ships that were used in the Russian-Japanese War. And again, this war was really something that I'd never heard of, and I had to go away and find out about, because I had never heard of it. And then once I started to look into the connection, I realized that there was a bit of Chinese whispers there. My uncle had got his wires crossed a little bit, and then actually those ships that Japan had ordered were much earlier, and the connection went even further back. So I think some of you will be familiar with, he's often dubbed the Scottish samurai, Thomas Blake Glover, and there's a famous book by the same name, The Scottish Samurai, by Alex Mackay. So that was my first foray into the history of the Meiji period when I read this book, and of course from there on I was completely hooked, and that led me to go to visit Japan in my late 20s, and I taught English at Nova. If anyone is familiar with the company Nova, they died a spectacular death about 20 years ago, I think it was, when the company folded. So I worked there in Osaka for a year, and then of course I was still really very much interested in history. So I went back to finish my master's degree in St Andrews, where I did museum studies, and then I focused my interest in Japan, and in particular Glover's family home. So for those of you who are not familiar with Thomas Blake Glover, he was a merchant, a Scottish merchant from Aberdeen, who became very successful in Japan through his various projects. He's often connected with Mitsubishi as being one of the financial backers of Mitsubishi, and he also was connected with the Choshu Five and a lot of students from the Satsuma clan, who he funded to come over to the UK, and some of those students studied in Scotland also. So that was really how I got into this this field, and then I did my master's degree in. I did a case study of the Glover's family home. It's been turned into a museum, which has been a spectacular failure. And I don't know really what the situation with that house is, but at the time, I think during the bubble era, the museum was kind of was thought of as capitalizing on the kind of Japan's success, and really the people who were running the project kind of used Mitsubishi as a bit of a cash cow to get this museum started. It's just really a historic house that has really very little connection with Glover. It was Glover's family who lived there, not Glover himself. And the museum, if you can call it really a museum, it's just a restored house that has it's been restored to a fantastic level, very nicely decorated inside to look like an 18th a house from the 1800s, but it doesn't really have anything that really tangibly connects the house with Glover. So it just really tells the story of Glover. It has a tatami room, and it has a suit of armor that was gifted by the Mitsubishi Corp to the museum itself. But there's not really any connection there with Glover. And over the years, I think the museum has kind of had fallen into disrepair. I've really no idea what the situation is there, but that was my master's thesis was a critique of the bad handling of that museum. And then I was able to get a MEX scholarship that I applied for from Scotland, and I was accepted to Kobe University. So I decided it would be a great idea to continue my interest in the topic of Japan somehow, without really having any idea about what I was going to study. But I got this scholarship, so I decided that, you know, I'm just going to have to try and make this work somehow. And I ended up in Kobe. And again, really I had very little clue about other than Kobe. It had some foreign houses, so surely there must be some something that I could study and I could get my teeth into. I had really no idea other than there's a few Ijinkan in Kobe itself. So I guess there must be some kind of foreign connection that I could exploit. So that really brought me to the sports club, the Kobe Regatta and Athletic Club. Now, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Kobe at all, but there is a sports club that doesn't have any. It's not an Ijinkan. It's like a brand new building from the 60s, a building from the 60s, and it's got some of the old material from the original club, and on the staircase in the club was an old photograph, and in that photograph there's a photograph of three gentlemen seated with Scottish flag insignias on their white uniforms, and the main guy that's sitting in those three gentlemen, his name was Sim. So Alexander Cameron Sim. Now, the name Sim comes from the northeast of Scotland, where I come from. So immediately I saw that this, so the Glover House Museum in Scotland is different from the Glover Ippomatsu, the Ijinkan that's in Nagasaki. So it's a separate. That's Glover's actual house was in Nagasaki, and Glover Museum in Aberdeen. The Glover House Museum is something different. So I'm not really sure the status of that museum at the moment. Anyway, the insignia and the gentleman I saw with this big handlebar moustache, quite imposing looking gentleman, I saw the name and I thought that name can only come from the northeast of Scotland. So I looked into it, and sure enough, Alexander Cameron Sim was the captain, the first captain of the first really and only captain of the KRNAC, came from Aberlour, which was hop, skip, and a jump from where I grew up. So that really drew my interest in Kobe and got me on the path of finding something that I could study for my project, my research project in Kobe University. And then I spent a couple of years trying to figure out what it was that I was going to research. But while I was in Kobe University, I was really a bit of an elephant in the room for the Japanese Studies department at Kobe University. They really didn't know what to do with me, and they weren't really sure or interested in what I was trying to articulate in terms of the foreign population. And my time in Kobe University was really not a waste of time, perhaps is not really the best way to describe it, but it was kind of fruitless, and I decided to draw a line under it. So I wasn't really going anywhere. It felt like I was treading water at Kobe University. And to cut a long story short, I put up my studies on hold for a little while, and then I managed to get a scholarship to come across to Australia. Ironically, where the Harold S. Williams collection is, so the collection that really allowed me to complete my PhD. I very quickly found out that the majority of the information that I needed was in this collection in the Australian National Library. So it actually made more sense for me to decamp and come to Sydney to complete my PhD. So that's how I ended up in Australia. So the title of my talk this evening is I'm talking about two Scottish sojourners. So if I, in fact, Scottish sojourners before I begin, get my spelling right. So that's really what the word that I could use for these two individuals that I'm going to be talking about tonight, because they really traveled the world at a time when it wasn't really something that was available for the average person to do, and they really globe-trotted, if you like, to various locales before they ended up in Japan, in Kobe. So the two people in question are Alexander Cameron Sim, or AC Sim, as he's affectionately known in Kobe, and he's often referred to as AC Sim in some of the literature that does mention him. And then we can see that insignia that from this famous photograph that exists in the stairwell of the KRNAC, the Kobe Regatta and Athletic Club in Kobe. And the second person that I'll focus on tonight is Professor James Murdoch. Now both men are from the northeast of Scotland, like myself. In fact, Murdoch comes from just down the road from where I grew up. And I think if it hadn't been for these two individuals, I'm not really sure if I would have been, I would have kept up with my interest in Japan, really. So it's thanks to these two guys, really, that I find myself still interested in the history of foreigners during the Meiji era. And if it hadn't been for those two, I'm not sure how much I would have stuck with it. But thanks to these two guys, I'm still here. So, I mean, as we're all familiar with, I'm speaking to an educated audience here. There were other treaty ports, but the main treaty ports that existed in Japan, of course, are Nagasaki, Yokohama, and Kobe. Now, Nagasaki was where Glover was initially active. So he was really, I guess, the first of the Scots to make his mark on Japan, and it's really through him that we see a lot of other well-known Scots arriving in Japan and making some kind of mark in Japan through his recommendation. So he's kind of this almost omnipresent sort of I don't know if it's godlike status, but I could say, but he seems to have his finger in an inordinate amount of pies in Japan during this time period. Now, of course, Yokohama, we do have, you know, flotsam and jetsam of foreigners in Yokohama. There's a huge amount of Europeans went through Yokohama during this time, and we have this very diverse and dynamic population for a number of years before we get the settlement of Kobe, which opens up in 1868. Now, we often hear of Kobe referred to as the model settlement, and I think even some people who are long-term residents of Kobe or who grew up in Kobe seem to have this kind of snobbish mentality that Kobe is the kind of the number one place for foreigners. It has this there is definitely a Kobe attitude, I think, amongst those foreigners who did grow up in Kobe, and certainly people like Harold S. Williams, who was probably the number one historian for the Kobe settlement, certainly has that high opinion of themselves and of Kobe. Now, both men, Alexander Cameron Sim, spent most of his life in Kobe, and James Murdoch himself spent a considerable amount of time in Kobe as well, writing for the Kobe Chronicle. Now, the two men did know each other. It's clear from the research that I have done that they were friends. How friendly they were is not really that clear, but there is some mention of Sim in Murdoch's work, but that doesn't tell me that there was a particularly strong friendship, because Sim is really mentioned by everyone who has anything to do with Kobe. So anyone who went through Kobe or spent any time in Kobe mentions Sim, and he is this kind of larger than life figure who seems to have had a kind of, again, a top dog personality in Kobe itself, as a kind of very masculine figure, and a person who everyone seems to look up to and admire, and has an almost kind of militaristic, autocratic personality. And we'll go into a little bit more detail as to what kind of person he was in a minute. But just to give you an idea for those of you perhaps who are not familiar with Scottish geography, the northeast of Scotland is not a particularly large place. In the 1800s, the population wasn't particularly large by any stretch, and Sim came from around this area here. This is Banffshire. I grew up in this area here, just really between the two. I initially grew up in Stonehaven, just around the corner from where Murdoch grew up. Murdoch grew up in a parish called Fetteresso, which is a blink and you miss it village just outside of Stonehaven. So both men were came from very humble beginnings, very poor backgrounds, but managed to work their way up to some. They were really self-made men by the time of their deaths. So one of the an interesting quote that I always come back to, which kind of tells me a lot about the Scots abroad, and I'm not really trying to say that aren't the Scots great, but really circumstances did cause a lot of Scots to make the most of their avenues in the British Empire. But as you can see, as Charles Dilke had said, in the British settlements from Canada to Ceylon, Dunedin to Bombay, for every Englishman that you meet who has worked himself to wealth in small beginnings without external aid, you find 10 Scotchmen. It's strange indeed that Scotland has not become the popular name for the United Kingdom. Now, that's as you know, that's one way. That's obviously Charles Dilke is having his a little bit of fun there. But how strong the Scottish identity among Scots abroad was, I'm not really 100% sure. You know, I'm very secure in my Scottish identity, very proud of my Scottish identity. How other Scots, how proud they were of being Scottish, or did they have, or were they more proud of their Britishness, is difficult for me to clarify sometimes. But I think Sim and especially Murdoch as well, are these two men stand out for me as kind of quintessentially Scottish people, in the terms that they, even though they never really returned to Scotland, they still remain very much indefatigable as Scottish people. Now, I came across an article in the University of Aberdeen's archives, where there's a scholar from the university referred to in 1922 to the ubiquitous Aberdonians. So Aberdonian is someone from Aberdeen, but Aberdonians are actually very well represented in Japan's Meiji history. And of course, the granddaddy of them all there, Thomas Blake Glover, he's the industrialist, merchant extraordinaire. He's considered to be the inspiration for Puccini's Madame Butterfly. Whether there's any truth to that or not is another story. But he is, among other things, well known for gun running, opium smuggling. Was initially a Jardine and Matheson merchant. That's what brought him to the East, the Far East. And then, like many Scots after him, they seem to have arrived in Hong Kong and Shanghai and found that there's too many Scots, and they've eaten up all the opportunities. So there's time to go somewhere else to see if we can find pastures new and sort of make some more cash. So he's really one of the first to get out there to Nagasaki. And initially, it looks like he's been sent out there by Jardine and Matheson. But interestingly, a long-term friend of mine has recently become the CEO of the Crombie. So the famous jackets, the Crombie jackets, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. So my friend from Aberdeen has recently revitalized the company and started to make the jackets again. And in his dealings with the archives from the Crombie Mills, he came across some information that the Crombie, the head of Crombie at the time, had asked Thomas Blake Glover to go out to find new markets for the Crombie wool. So one of he was kind of employed in a couple of again trying to make the most of his opportunities in the Far East. But one of those opportunities that he was trying to explore was to sell Crombie wool to the Japanese. So he's one of the perhaps the most ubiquitous of the Aberdonians in Japan. But we've also got A. Shand. So, or rather, I suppose I could really deal with Brunton. Brunton was also from just outside Aberdeen, a tiny village called Muckles. And Richard Brunton was is known as the father of Japanese lighthouses. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with these Oya Toi Gaikokujin are often labeled the father of something in Japan, so that the father of Japanese lighthouses, or the father of sport, or the father of banking, or the father of physics, or something. There's always a fatherly, benevolent title to some of these people. And Richard Brunton was a recommendation of Glover, and he was trained by the Stephensons in lighthouse design, and he is responsible for numerous firsts in Japan, such as the first iron bridge in Yokohama, the first sewage system, the first detailed maps of Yokohama, I think, were Richard Henry Brunton's maps. Gas street lighting was another thing that he was famous for. He doesn't seem to have been a particularly a nice guy. If you read his memoir, he's very critical of the Japanese, to the point of sometimes being a bit insulting. A very high opinion of himself and his own ability. Very ambitious man, but nevertheless he made his mark on Japanese modernization. A.A. Shand, he was a local boy, grew up very close to where Alexander Cameron Sim grew up, in Turriff, again, the northeast of Scotland. He went out to Japan as, again, another father, considered the father of modern banking. And then he went out there as a young man of 20 years old, and became, after he'd been in India, and in 1872 he was employed by the Japanese Ministry of Finance, and then he was the first person to detail the bank bookkeeping. So he was the first person to introduce Western banking accountancy practices or techniques to the Japanese. And he also helped to Japanese bankers to set up the first central bank in 1874. And then we've got Sutherland, Sir Thomas Sutherland. So again, another banker, the founder of the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, or HSBC. He's from Aberdeen University graduate, went out to establish a China Nagasaki shipping line, and then later Yokohama and Kobe line in 1866. And then 1869, he effectively opened Japan to tourism through cruises, whereby Japan became a popular tourist destination. In 1874, he became managing director of P&O Shipping between 1884 and 1900. So at that point, really, these are just a snapshot of some of the Scots at that time, the more famous Northeast Scots who were making their mark on Japan at this time. Now, if any of you have been to the cemetery in Yokohama, or the Foreign Cemetery in Kobe, but Yokohama is full of grave sites with the city Aberdeen, born in Aberdeen, written on the gravestones. And really, this was testament to Aberdeen's place as a shipbuilding center at that time. So by the sort of late 1850s, Aberdeen was had reached its peak as a shipbuilding center. It had really failed to make that transition towards steamships, and it was really still rooted in sail ship design. And the best sail ships, or the best T-clip, were being built in Japan. So Thermopylae, the fastest T-clipper at the time, and that was an Aberdeen-built ship. And then Glover also tried to revitalize the shipbuilding industry in Aberdeen by getting a few orders in for ships for the Satsuma clan. So I think the Josho Maru, I think it was called, or the Whirlwind, was Japan's first modern warship, I believe. So that was ordered by Glover on behalf of the Satsuma clan. So that was really the last the last really good order of ships for the Aberdeen shipping industry at that time. After that, it really started to decline quite rapidly. So Glover had helped to prop that up for a few more years, longer than it perhaps should have done, thanks to orders from Japanese clans at the time who were eager to get their hands on modern warships. So around about that time as well, we have a visit to Aberdeen University by Lawrence Oliphant, who is fresh back from Japan after his accompanying the Earl of Elgin to organize the treaties with Japan in 1857. And at the University of Aberdeen, he gives a talk entitled Notes on Japan about the customs interests of the Japanese. Now, I would like to think at that time that someone like Alexander Cameron Sim was in attendance of this at this talk. I've no real way of knowing, but I'm sure at that time the seed has been planted within Aberdeen that Japan is open for business, and there's this very exotic locale that's previously been shut off to the west for the last couple of 100 years, and there's an opportunity there for men of the city to go out there and get their hands on some riches or just experience this exotic culture. I've really no idea what motivated people, but I'd like to think that this was a turning point in the history of Northeast Scotland and the opening of empire, if you like. So who was A.C. Sim? So he was born in a farm ship called Boharm, which is just outside Aberlour in Banffshire in Scotland in 1840. Aberlour these days is famous for Walker shortbread. So I'm sure most of you have had Walker shortbread at some point in your life, the famous biscuits from Scotland. And Sim was born just a couple of kilometers up the road from that factory. He came from a humble background, a humble family. They were really tenant farmers who rented a farm. But the family was well educated. They obviously saw education as a pathway to prosperity. And his brother George was a well-known antiquarian and naturalist in Aberdeen. And since I've been looking into these the life of Alexander Cameron Sim, I'm sure some of you have done a DNA test with Ancestry.com. Without really, just purely by coincidence, it seems to be that a distant relative of mine appears to have been a relative of Alexander Cameron Sim. So coincidentally, many years after looking into this, I find myself related to this man without realizing. So that's been quite a surreal experience. But he very quickly moves up the ranks of becoming a pharmacist in various chemists in the northeast of Scotland. He has a brief period in Aberdeen University, and then lands himself a job as a pharmacist in the Royal Hospital in London. Now, while Sim is there, he's a member of the London Scottish Rifles, so he's very much an amateur military man, if you like. But he's obviously clearly got some kind of ambition. There's reference in the Royal Hospital at the time of Sim asking for a pay rise, so he clearly thinks he's due one. Doesn't get one, unfortunately, or fortunately perhaps. So he decides to jack it in and gives him and leaves for the Far East for Hong Kong. Now, obviously, there's been some some connection there. I'm not really sure what the connection is. There's obviously some London connection that he's made while he's down there at the Royal Hospital, and this connection has made some kind of progress in Hong Kong. So that's the draw. There's a drug or a chemist known as Llewellyn's Drug Hall. So I haven't really found out much about who Llewellyn is, but clearly he was a friend, I think, of Sims. I'm assuming he's a friend of Sims from his London days, and Sim has gone out there to join or work for Llewellyn in Hong Kong. So initially he works at the Royal Naval Hospital in Hong Kong, and again I think perhaps at the time, perhaps arrived a little bit too late to make his mark. Hong Kong was probably beginning to be a quite bustling and large settlement by that time, and perhaps chances weren't as readily available as he might have hoped they were. So he very quickly moves up to Shanghai and follows Llewellyn to Shanghai. And again, doesn't seem to want to hang around for very long in Shanghai. Again, I'm assuming because the settlement was starting to become larger. And then he finds his way to Nagasaki, and then reaches Kobe by about 1870 or just late 1869. So by the time he arrives, he's lauded as a boating star. So he's obviously got himself a reputation as some kind of athlete. And I'm assuming that he developed this reputation in Hong Kong. There's various boating clubs that existed in Hong Kong and Shanghai at this time. A lot of sports clubs that were beginning to develop, cricket clubs. Horse racing was obviously a big feature of the settlements in Hong Kong and Shanghai as well. So when he arrives in Kobe, he's lauded as a boating star. So this is a kind of a beginning of Sim's athletic career, if you like. So this leads Sim and several other individuals in Kobe at this time to form the Kobe and Regatta Athletic Club in 1870. So you may or may not have heard of the Kobe club. So these kind of two clubs had a kind of friendly rivalry. The Kobe club began as the international club, whereas the Kobe Regatta and Athletic Club, it kept its name from the moment of inception, and it still exists. I think barely. It's hanging on by its fingernails, but it still exists today as of 2024. Now I can see Mike Galbraith in the audience here, and now he may disagree with this this statement, but people from Kobe, and particularly Kobe Regatta and Athletic Club members, they consider themselves to be the oldest unbroken club in Japan, the club that's had the same name since 1870 until the present day. So whereas the YC and AC has perhaps an earlier inception date, then the name began as the Yokohama Cricket Club and changed. I think it was in the 1880s. Maybe Mike can clarify that for us. But people in Kobe, and maybe I or maybe not, I agree with them, but they believe they have the ownership of the oldest club, oldest existing club in Japan. So there was a friendly rivalry between these two clubs. The Kobe club being the more elite institution that catered to your diplomat or military brass. It was generally a lot more exclusive, harder to get in, had a lot of very strange rules about who could join, who couldn't join. So in a city that was predominantly merchant or insurance agent careers, everyone had a career as a merchant or an insurance agent. Merchants weren't allowed to join, whereas the Kobe and Regatta Athletic Club was a much more egalitarian institution, and it allowed anyone to join. So it began in the 24th of September 1870, had a $10 Mexican membership fee, which was, you know, a sizable amount of money at that time, or a $30 Mexican lifetime membership. So it began at a time when in Kobe in 1870, if you read the early newspapers from that time, there's a lot of reports of crime, of it being quite a dangerous place. Some people are reported to have be walking around wearing a pistol, and there's definitely a feeling of a kind of Wild West frontier town at that time. I think it would make a fantastic mini series if we could have some sort of Wild East. And of course there's routinely run-ins with local samurai, and some drunken sailors have found themselves on the wrong end of a katana. So there's clearly some need for some kind of pastime, or some kind of unofficial gathering spot to keep people in check. So it seems that the Kobe Athletic Club, Regatta Athletic Club, is there for this purpose, to kind of keep the men in check and and stop people from getting drunk and committing petty crimes, or really perhaps safety in numbers, where the people who consider themselves to be civilized and respectable need a place to gather where they can enjoy themselves and exchange information, or and keep themselves out of trouble. So it's a very interesting time to set up the club. Now, again, it takes it's very similar to the clubs that existed at the same time in other parts of the British Empire. Not that Japan was part of the British Empire, but it's very similar to clubs that existed in the Indian Raj, in colonial Hong Kong. Again, in the settlements of Shanghai, we see similar clubs setting up. So what we're seeing in Kobe, Nagasaki, Yokohama are very similar to those institutions. Now, it seems to have been, having these kind of clubs seems to have been a real draw for many men to access these kind of sports. Now, I'm not sure at this time how popular or how accessible these kind of sports would have been to your average working class individual in Scotland, for sure. But even other parts of the UK, I don't think it was something that a working class gentleman could easily get access to as recreation and sports. It was definitely something that was more of an elite pastime for individuals who went to public school in particular. So this was a really egalitarian membership. So it was a chance for working class individuals who were in the employ of companies over in Japan, or who are working as merchants, to really kind of climb the class ladder and sort of buy into a little bit of that lifestyle that they might have been excluded to from back home in the UK. And generally speaking, candidature of these clubs translated to a place at the or some involvement with some kind of the municipal council. So Kobe at that time had quite an organized municipal council, which if you look at the membership of that council, those same people can generally be found on the roll of the Kobe Club or the KRNAC, or if not both. So there's a definite correlation here between club membership and running the settlement itself. So along with the KRAC, we've also got the Concordia Club, the German club, in Kobe. We've got Freemasonry is very prominent also in Kobe as well. Now, Sim, I'm not 100% sure if he was considered not eligible for a more exclusive international club. He may have been excluded from that. He may or may have not been a Freemason, so he may have not been able to get into the Freemasons Lodge. So it may have been just an opportunity for him to really create his own club that he could get to. And he's definitely been a crucial figure in the formation of the club, because there is a need for a captain of the club, and Sim is given the role of captain of the club. So this is a kind of an unusual role. It's not so much president. It seems to be very much an unofficial role, but he's considered the captain of the club, and he's the only person to have this title, the captain of the club. So it's seen as, although there were several individuals involved in the formation of this club, it's very much seen as Sim's baby. He's the guy who seems to be the person who everyone looks up to at this club. So the club really began with the premise of fostering international relations between Japanese and foreigner, but this never really seems to have materialized. Now, there could be a number of reasons. Perhaps the Japanese just weren't interested in this crazy foreigners doing rowing and chucking a ball around the park. So there may have been an element that the Japanese just really didn't get what was going on at these sports clubs. But there also doesn't really seems to be much of an effort to involve the Japanese in these early stages in the games until much later. As the club grows in prominence, then we see more prominent Japanese being invited to the club. But again, only very elite Japanese, working class Japanese or lower class Japanese are certainly not invited to join. And also there was a large Chinese population in Kobe at this time as well, working as stevedores and really as go-betweens between foreigners and Japanese. And there's really seems to have been no effort to include the Chinese again until much later, until about the 1890s. And again, the idea of mixing Chinese, Japanese foreigners, as in Western foreigners, together, it doesn't really happen in any kind of meaningful way throughout the club's history, despite the fact that it was designed to foster international relationships. Now, just not long after this photograph, or this may have been the older building or the building that was built after the typhoon, but there was a typhoon in 1871. It was fairly catastrophic, and it basically took out the whole bund, the main bund of Kobe, and destroyed many buildings with a huge tidal surge. And the club was one of the first things to be destroyed. So this is a kind of I think a catalyst in Alexander Cameron Sim's life, because at this juncture, the club, the KREC, really takes on a role as being an area that people congregate to create some sort of disaster relief to help out those in need. Initially, it's for foreigners, so it's the relief committee that's formed is the relief is distributed to foreigners through the KREC. But as disasters come in the preceding years, or in the following years, then we see more and more relief efforts towards Japanese communities coming from the KREC. So you can see here we've got the boathouse at Mirame, which is much further inland now in Kobe. It's about a good kilometre inland. The original shoreline has been extended through land reclamation, but you can see there that there was quite a lot of well-established buildings along the main bund in Kobe, which were, you know, pretty much wiped out by this typhoon in 1871. So here's a couple of interesting photographs that we can have a look at here. So this is the initial photograph that I saw, and I had really hoped that this was a football team, but it turned out to be an athletic team. So there was an athletic regatta that took place in 1885 between Scotland, England, and Germany, and the Scots won this tournament. And I think it was really off the back of Alexander Cameron's sim. I don't think anyone else was particularly athletic in the settlement at this time. But Sim appears to have been a genuine athlete, someone who can run from. There was a famous marathon that was held, I think, in the mid 1870s between two individuals, but it was considered a marathon at one of the first marathons that to be done or held in Japan. And Sim, I think it's this individual here. He races this gentleman here from the settlement to the top of Maya-san in Kobe. Now it's about a good 14 kilometers, I think, and I think about 10 or 12 years ago they recreated this run, and as an inaugural event, members of the KRAC were invited to join for free, and I managed to blag a spot as well because of my research. And I attempted to do this run, a much shorter run, 10 kilometers up from the bottom of Maya-san to the top, and it nearly destroyed me. And I had trained quite a lot to do this run. And I think his initial time was an hour and a half. Now I did mine. I think I was pushing 2 hours by the time I finished mine. And although there were some very fit Japanese people who did finish in I think just over an hour, those people were like in peak physical condition. So he must have genuinely been a proper athlete to have been able to run from the settlement to the top. And considering what kind of shoes would he have been wearing at those times, if he was wearing these high boots, or was it or very small light plimsolls, or what? And there was no real road at that time from the settlement to Maya-san. It would have just been a dirt trail all the way up to the top of the mountain. So a genuine impressive feat from a guy in the 1870s to be able to do that. Now the other photograph we can see here, so a much older Sim you can see in 1888 here, sitting amongst the first. This is considered to be the first football match in Japan, which was an interport, which was the name given to the tournaments between Yokohama and Kobe, sometimes Nagasaki and Shanghai, but the most famous rivalry was between Kobe and Yokohama. I'm not really sure who has the most number of wins, but on this occasion, the football match was won by Kobe. Now, I think this is considered on the Japanese Football League's website as the first official football game. Now, I don't know if they were playing under association rules at this time, or if this was actually the case. So association rules being modern soccer, was it an actual game of modern soccer, or was it football which sometimes they refer to down here in Australia, where rugby, or it could be Australian rules style football. So I'm not 100% sure if when they say this is the first football game in Japan, whether it is genuinely football or soccer as we know it. But it's an interesting picture all the same. So again, was Sim a player or was Sim the referee? But advancing age, I'm not 100% sure if he was a player or not, but it's very interesting to see how much he fostered games such as football, rugby, athletics, boating, really any sport that you can think of was disseminated by the KRNAC through to the wider population of Kansai during this time. So Sim obviously had a business, so he was a druggist or a chemist while he was captain of the club. That was his main business, and he's considered to be the first person to sell Ramune in this style of bottle. Now, Ramune itself is just a Japanese pronunciation of lemonade, and there were various Ramunes that existed at the time, but they were very inconsistent and not really didn't follow a particular recipe, which could change frequently. But Sim is considered to be the first person to actually have a consistent recipe for Ramune, and he has this popping bottle, which is now beloved in Japan. So Sim is considered to be the first person to start this drink. Now, the reason why it became so popular and why Sim began to sell it was labeled as a cure or a preventative drink for cholera. Now, around about the late 1870s, cholera had came to Japan, and it really had a pretty disastrous effect on anyone who contracted it. Had something like an 80% death rate of people who were infected with cholera. So you're really not left with much chance to recover from this disease. And at the time, people thought, or people were being told that Tansan or carbonated water, if you gargled with carbonated water, that this was a preventative measure, and it would keep the cholera away. Now, this is Sim has a great reputation in Kobe as being a kind of humanitarian. He's famous for his disaster relief efforts, but at this time, he surely must have been aware that this, as a druggist, that this had very little effect on cholera. So he was effectively peddling his Ramune and profiteering basically off of cholera epidemics. So he sold his Ramune for a good 4 or 5 times more expensive than other brands, because his one was considered to be the most effective against cholera. And around about 1880, he makes an absolute fortune selling his Ramune during a cholera pandemic, and he ends up, because of this, becoming one of the most wealthy people in the settlement. So it's a very interesting side of his character. So he's lauded as this humanitarian and famous for his disaster relief efforts, but this is a kind of a dark blemish on his character here, that he is he's using Ramune as a cure when obviously it has no effect whatsoever on cholera. and he makes a 4,000 to 5,000 yen profit from this venture. So so through this gives him some sort of financial freedom, if you like, to focus more on the club and to give himself a bit more financial freedom to build a name for himself as a humanitarian later on. Now, with this profits that he makes from selling his ramune, he buys a large yacht, which he uses to navigate the inland sea. And at this time in Japan, many native Japanese are not allowed to navigate the inland sea by themselves, and only foreign pilots are allowed to do this. So he's one of the, I think perhaps the only one who's not a recognized pilot or ship's pilot to be able to navigate the inland sea. So he has a crew, Japanese crew of about four or five people, and he sails up and down the inland sea basically at his leisure. And then various visitors who come to Kobe and who want to see a little bit of the islands, they get in contact with Sim, and he takes them down and also gives his boat for charter. And at this time, he kind of builds himself up as a shipbuilder. He seems to have had some shipbuilding knowledge from where he grew up in Aberdeenshire. There seems to have been some shipbuilding, riverboat shipbuilding knowledge from his father, who was a fisherman. So he's able to capitalize on this knowledge and becomes a bit more prolific as a ship owner, as a ship builder, as a salvage. What's the word? A person who can salvage ships that have washed up on the shore or have run into difficulty, and a shipwright. So he starts a little business up as a shipwright. So he starts to have his fingers in a lot of pies. And again, as I said at the beginning, he's a fairly ambitious guy. Starts to eye things like the police. Wants to become a policeman. Puts his name forward for the police, and he loses out to a Swedish guy called Herman Trotzig. Now, I'm not sure why he loses out, but anyway, he does lose out. But he does seem to get a consolation prize, which is the fire chief. So he's awarded the role of fire chief. Now, this is a kind of a role that's not, although it doesn't really sound that impressive today. In the settlements, if you were given the role of fire chief, that was generally for people who are financially successful or financially significant. So, for example, in Yokohama, the Kesicks, of Jardine and Matheson fame, they were the ones who always occupied the role of fire chief. So, similarly, people who became chair of the Yokohama Race Club, for example, always went to financially significant people in the settlement or people who had some sort of political sway. So he became Ramune tycoon. He's captain of the KRAC club. He's got his own business as a druggist. Buys himself a yacht, sets himself up as a shipwright, and really has Kobe wrapped around his little finger by this time. So he's a pretty significant figure by around the late 1880s. And it's this larger than life personality that really gives him this sense of civic duty that really has no parallel in any of the other ports. So he starts to make a name for himself after several disasters such as earthquakes, typhoons, etc., starts to really take an interest in raising money and becoming a guy who's a humanitarian. As a volunteer, he often funds his own relief missions to Osaka. When there's a typhoon, he takes his own boat and starts to dish out the relief by himself. And then there's a few other significant relief missions that stand out in particular. So in 1891, there's an enormous earthquake in the Mino-Awari earthquake, and Sim goes up to the affected area. It's killed at least I think 10,000 people were reported were killed, and Sim goes up there, organizes a leadership mission, stays up there for a few months, donates a lot of carpentry tools so that people can rebuild the houses. And this is really well received by the Japanese population of the affected area. So again, because of this, he seems to have taken on this role of this benevolent benefactor for Kobe. So every time there's some sort of disaster, Sim is the first person to act or to get some kind of relief mission going. Now there seems to be a little bit of rivalry between some residents in Kobe is who can get the disaster relief mission going the quickest. But Sim always seems to have the edge, so he seems to be the guy who does it quickly. There's another missionary whose name escapes me from Kobe. He's considered to be the father of mountaineering in Japan. He organizes a mission as well, and he writes a book about his account of the relief mission that he does. But there's no mention of Sim, so there seems to be like rivalry. Who can be the most? Who can be the best humanitarian between some of the residents of Kobe? So it seems to be who can out volunteer the other. But in 1896, there's a tsunami hits north of Japan, and then the Sanriku coastline is very badly affected. 22,000 people lose their lives there. Sim spends weeks in this area in 1896, helping people rebuild their houses. And it's this that by this time he's built himself up a reputation of being a real asset to the Japanese population by helping out people in badly affected areas. So it naturally attracts the attention of the Japanese emperor at this time, and he's recognized for his efforts for disaster relief, and he's given personally by the Japanese emperor in 1896 a set of sakezuki, a set of silver sake cups by the emperor himself. Now it's a mystery where these cups have gone. Nobody really seems to know what happened to them, but it was quite an honor for a foreigner at this time to be awarded by the emperor. And again, this cements Sim's status as this very prominent individual. Again, not quite able to get to the higher echelons of the society in Kobe. He's not quite British ambassador level, but he's almost there. And interestingly, when the settlement is handed over back to the Japanese, the British ambassador at the time, or the British consul, is indisposed, becomes sick. I'm not sure if he becomes sick or if he takes a step down to allow Sim to hand over the keys. So it comes down to Sim to hand over the keys to the Japanese in 1899. So it's quite fitting that this role goes to Sim, and at this point, 1899, he is given the position of the head of, or the unofficial head of the Kobe Fire Brigade. And then, sadly, just 1 year after this, Sim is in Osaka with a friend, and he eats oysters in a restaurant in Osaka, and then he succumbs to typhoid after eating these oysters. And then there you go, oysters. Yeah, so oyster junkie. So he's obviously an oyster junkie himself. And then he and his companion succumbed to typhoid just a few weeks afterwards. Now his funeral is documented in the Kobe Chronicle of 1900, and from looking through the newspapers in Kobe and Yokohama over the years about funerals of foreigners, I've never come across a description of a funeral where the whole town, the whole Japanese population come out to see off Sim as he's for the funeral. So this is something that's kind of quite unique amongst foreigners, certainly amongst foreigners in Kobe. So that's one very interesting aspect of someone who would become known as the father of sport in Western Japan. So here's another father, the birth of another father, and then so that's really Mr. Sim. So that kind of leads us on to a mention here of a poem. So James Murdoch was many things. He wasn't a poet, wasn't one of them. His poems are really pretty dreadful. But if you've ever come across any of his literature that he wrote, so Don Juan's Grandson in Japan is probably the best of all of the books that he wrote. But there's a poem that exists it's really a kind of a compilation of, or a miscellany of doggerel, really, short stories and poetry. But we've got reference here to a poem about the inland sea and specifically Kobe. So I often sigh when I think of the nights and you have spent in talks with Dottie Sim. So here we are. So there's obviously some clear friendship between Murdoch and Sim. Doesn't go into too much detail about it there, but there's clearly an affinity with a fellow Northeast Scot. And then again, there's reference to the club and its importance. And again, this kind of mythical or fabled butting of heads between the local population and the government officials who are always kept at bay from joining the clubs. So who was Murdoch? Murdoch again is a second person. James Murdoch, born in Stonehaven, 1856. A few years after someone like A.C. Sim, so a good 14 years after Sim's birth. And again, someone who is from a humble background, but is really, rather than being a person who is a pioneer, he's more of an academic. So he is an academically gifted student, wins a bursary to go to Aberdeen University at the time. And around about this time, or perhaps a few years before, there's another Japanese student who is a young Satsuma samurai who's funded by Thomas Blake Glover to come to live with his family in Aberdeen, and he attends the school just down the road from the university. So again, does that resonate with Murdoch? Was he aware of that? Again, it's quite a small place, quite a small population at that time, and I'm sure the significance of that would have perhaps been had some play with Murdoch's decision later to go to Japan. So he excels at classics, Greek and Latin. There's no, at this stage, there's no real giveaway that he's interested in a life in the East. And then he, from Aberdeen University, he goes to Oxford briefly, to the Sorbonne, and then he's comes back to Aberdeen to teach for a year. But really, he has ants in his pants. He can't stay in one place for more than 5 minutes, and he is really kind of drawn, sees the value of his education and the money that he can make traveling to different parts of the empire. So he very quickly, after his marriage and his first son his first and only son is born, he takes up a position in Australia. So he comes down to Australia to the Maryborough and Brisbane high schools, where he's given a very prestigious position as a school principal. But he doesn't really seem to stay very long. He's at a time when being an atheist is really quite rare, and would have gone down like a lead balloon in most high schools at this time. He is an ardent atheist, and this may have been a problem at Maryborough, and he quits for some reason. That may have been a paid dispute, but it's most likely because of his atheism. So this is where the town where Murdoch came for, again, famous for shipping, more for fish than anything else. But really, the prospects for a young man who is interested in classics and Greek, there's not much for him there. So obviously, Murdoch had his eyes set on bigger prospects. So that's what brought him to Australia. So
Darren?
Yes.
We're getting close to 8:30, so
okay,
we
yeah.
need to wrap it up so we can get some questions in.
So Murdoch, he was a journalist. He wrote for the Boomerang. I'll just wrap this up quickly because Murdoch's perhaps not as interesting as Sim. But he traveled Australia writing articles for the Boomerang. But he was also at this time a real kind of foaming at the mouth racist. He had some very racist views towards the Chinese, which was kind of influenced by the Boomerang. And at this time, he produces a number of really pretty dreadful books. Ayami-san, which is based on his life in Japan, and he produces perhaps the only or the first poem in Scots that's published in Japan, which is certainly a first. He's kind of famous for in a lot of his books for really basing his books upon his own life. He was a proponent of not a proponent, but a customer of Nectarine No. 9, which was a famous brothel in Yokohama in the 1890s that was frequented by Hideo Noguchi, apparently, who's on the 1,000 yen note. So he was famously Natsume Soseki's teacher, very briefly for a 4-year period. Around this time, he embarks on a journalist career in Japan. He produces his own publication, a magazine called the Japan Echo, which is a spectacular failure, despite it being actually a quite modern publication for the time. It involves, it is really an international affair. He involves early Japanese photography pioneers, to publish in the magazine. From here, he jumps to Paraguay, to the New Australia colony, which is a spectacular failure. That brings him back eventually to Japan, where he kind of spends a long time in his wilderness years. He publishes and researches his first volumes for a history of Japan between 1903 and 1911. And then eventually, through publication of these books, he gets a chance to become the chair of Japanese studies at University of Sydney. So he develops a lifelong friendship with Soseki in later years, purely because Soseki rejects the Bungaku Hakushi in 1911. This resonates with Murdoch, who had rejected the Order of the Rising Sun twice. And then he asks Soseki to review his history of Japan. Now, Murdoch at this time was very optimistic about Japanese modernization. He really felt that Japan had a lot to offer the world, whereas Soseki at this point was very pessimistic that Japan was losing its essence really by pandering towards Western modernization. So it's just some pictures there of the New Australia colony, but Murdoch eventually returns to Australia, where he becomes the first chair of Japanese studies. But unfortunately, once he arrives in Australia, just as he's about to really begin and establishes himself as a Japan scholar, Japan expert, he succumbs to cancer and unfortunately dies.
Wow.
So that's really the end of the story. So if we want to have some questions there, I'm welcome to. I welcome your questions. Sorry to drone on.
Speaking of dying,
yeah,
you wanted to mention about your cemetery work in Kobe.
Oh yeah, the cemeteries. So I mean, this was initially why Alex Byrne had contacted me. I think was because of the cemeteries article that I had written. So I wrote an article about the cemeteries in Kobe and Osaka. And this was my first publication while I was at Kobe University, and it's the one which people contact me about the most. So I'm trying to get funding for a database, an online database, where people can trace or use it for research to trace their ancestors, or just to do some online research, because the cemetery itself is actually quite difficult to enter. It's not open very often, and it involves corresponding with the sexton at the cemetery, and it can be a bit of a convoluted process. So, and also the gravesite, the gravestones themselves are beginning to deteriorate quite rapidly. So something really needs to be done to document these grave sites as soon as possible. So that's something that I would really welcome anybody, if anyone's interested in becoming involved in that, or helping me to canvass funding. I would really appreciate your input, and please get in touch with me at this email if you feel that would be something that you would be interested in collaborating with.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right, if
you.
people want to unmute, they certainly can.